So in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. And the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Sarah, for reading that for us. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be continuing on our sermon series called Christ and Cataclysm, discerning God's heart when the world's falling apart. How in the world do we discern God's heart in the midst of a time that certainly feels like everything around us is falling apart? More tough news or tough circumstances could befall us at any point. And so how do we, the people of God, not only live in hope that God is doing something good in the midst of what's going on in our world right now, but how do we specifically discern God's heart and then be used by him is certainly what we're looking at in terms of this particular sermon series. And so what I want to do is I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and hopefully you can see this quite well. Hold on 1 second. There we go. And today we're going to be specifically looking at Christ and Cataclysm, and how the Israelites were ushered into a new era, and even how us in particular in this current times, how we're being ushered into a new era. And God is certainly looking to us, certainly asking us, right, to join him in his work, even in the midst of difficult times. And so I think in many ways, sort of the big question that's being asked by many is, especially by Christians, obviously, is the question of like, God, how are you working right now? And how can I be a part of it? In many ways, we feel sort of isolated, or even feel like we can't really figure out exactly how it is that God can use us. We almost are floundering in some senses of like, how do I not only wrestle with what's going on in the world around me, but how do I also lean into it as a follower of Jesus, and really move from pacifism to activism, where I'm an activist not only for, obviously chiefly for Christ, but also an activist for those who are marginalized, for those who have experienced the horrible systemic racism in our country, for those who have even experienced loved ones dying as a result of COVID. So how do we lean into what God is doing is essentially what we're going to be looking at today. Now, as we sort of get started, I just want us to be thinking about what a political cataclysm even is. And as I was thinking about how to even explain a political cataclysm, because it's sort of this large terminology that could include a lot of different things. I think when we think about a cataclysmic event, obviously Adam's been sharing with us that a cataclysm is an event that happens, sort of a violent event that sort of ushers in change. And so as we learned last week about a natural cataclysm, what is a political cataclysm, right? It seems kind of obvious that you just take sort of the founding work that Adam did for us in understanding a natural cataclysm and then use that to understand a political cataclysm. But I was thinking about how to explain it, and one of the first things that sort of popped into my mind was something that I've actually been watching recently, which is Downton Abbey. I don't know if you guys have been watching Downton Abbey, but we started it with our friends Jess and Tim, and I started watching it like when Sydney and I first got married, and I remember just being like, I don't like this. Like, I don't like this show. I fall asleep every time I watch it. But yet, I sort of picked it back up, and Sydney and I have been watching it. And one of the things that happened in the most recent episode was World War One. And World War One, this cataclysmic event sort of is ushered in. And as I was reading about World War One this week, just because I love history, I'm a history buff, and I was reading about a guy named Vernon Kellogg, who is a professor in the north of in America, and he traveled to the north of France. And in 1915, which was sort of after about a year of the war, the north of France was heavily occupied by Germans. And one evening he went to some like German shindig because he had been invited, because the Germans like loved inviting all these scholars and intellectuals to come talk about philosophy and all these things. And he heard these intellectuals, these philosophers, these economists, and military commanders speak of the Darwinian creed of natural selection, and that man has this brute ancestry. And in many ways, the German intellectuals preach this idea of natural selection to sort of get them really engaged in World War I. Their view was that if we win World War I, it will show the whole world that we are the superior people. But if we lose, that's okay. We'll take the punch and we'll know we're not the superior people. Well, obviously, World War I ended and was supposed to be the Great War that ended all war. And then just a few years later, World War II happens. And this idea of natural selection morphs not just into, brute ancestry, but a horrific, grotesque regime called Nazi Germany. And I was particularly struck by Vernon Kellogg, this professor, because he said when he heard that idea of natural selection, that Darwinian creed, that they were going to use it in this way, in an ill way, that it was sort of a defining moment for him, that he realized, wow, the United States of America really needs to get involved in World War I, because we can't allow this grotesque regime, this grotesque idea to come to fruition in our world. Well, in World War I, it was one particular moment that set off a cataclysm. And that was the assassination of the German-backed Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. They were murdered by the Serbian nationalists who are backed by the Russians. And then all of a sudden, World War I breaks out. And whether you take World War I or World War II, there's one major theme threaded throughout political cataclysms, and it's this: that a political cataclysm is a sudden change or disruption that creates a new era that people are ushered into. So a political cataclysm is a sudden change or disruption that creates a new era that people are ushered into. And I would say that this is true both willing and unwilling. There are those who go into a new era willingly, and there are those who go into a new era unwillingly. And so when we think about this, perhaps we should think about today. Let's think about today. Are we currently living in a political cataclysm, a moment like World War I, a moment like World War II? And my question would be, well, has there been a sudden change or disruption? A sudden change or disruption that creates a new era that we're being ushered into? Well, COVID-19, yes, both a natural cataclysm and a political cataclysm, as we've seen, yes. The crucial awakening of individuals to racism and systemic oppression here in the United States, yes. It's an awakening to the injustices and oppression that my brothers and sisters of color are experiencing. So yes, it's a new era in which I am living, in which we are living, that we cannot just look around and do nothing. For me in particular, I've been thinking like, I feel disoriented in this season and I need perspective. And the good news that I've experienced and that I want to extend to you is the good news is that God's word is full of narratives written before, after, and in political cataclysms. around, in, all over, that teach us and instruct us and fill us with wisdom as we serve God in the midst of our current cataclysm that is leading us into a new era. And so what we're going to do this afternoon is I just want to walk through the two passages, actually, both in the book of 2 Kings. And so if you have your Bible, I'd love for you to open it, or you feel free to, I'm going to have them up on the screen as well. But in 2 Kings chapter 17 is where we're going to start. And ultimately, there's two really important key truths that are illuminated to us about political cataclysms in 2 Kings that will sort of, I think, and I believe, help us navigate the era in which we are being ushered into today. And the very first truth is this, and before we even dive in, the very first truth is this: political cataclysms are caused by sin. Political cataclysms are caused by sin. Now, here's what I do not mean, and I want to be very, very clear. I do not mean that COVID-19 is the result of God's judgment on our sinfulness as a nation. I do not mean that the innocent murder of Black and brown brothers and sisters is God's method of waking up a nation to systemic oppression and racism that is running rampant in a nation that ought to be loving, serving, and protecting all people, regardless of the color of their skin. Here's what I do mean. I do mean that sin is the cause of chaos. I do mean that sin is the cause of us not always seeing each other rightly. That when people replace God at the center of order and wisdom, when they say, no, God, you know what, we got this. Thanks, God, we don't need you. We're good, we can handle ourselves. That political cataclysms are actually inevitable. Because it is seemingly impossible to have a sense of true justice and an ability to truly value others above yourself if you don't see others the way the Creator sees them. I think back about the first political cataclysm in Genesis chapter 3. Chaos enters into the world as a result of Adam and Eve's sin against God. And what did they do? Well, they replaced themselves at the center of order and wisdom. And they said ultimately, you know what, God, we got this. My self-will is more important than your will. And the result of their sin was that they were ushered into a new era where they had been banned from the presence of God and now lived in a world cursed by sin and death. And with this understanding, sort of this first cataclysmic moment, as we sort of trot through the narrative of 2 Kings 17, we'll see that a political cataclysm caused by sin. 2 Kings 17 is that, a political cataclysm caused by sin. And we'll pick up not only the truth that political cataclysms are caused by sin, but another along the way as well. So we're going to begin in verses 1 through 2 of 2 Kings 17. And here's what it says. It says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. And he reigned 9 years. And this bit's really important. It says, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not as the kings of Israel who were before him. So the narrative starts off with this final king of Israel named Hoshea. And every time a new king is listed in 1st and 2nd Kings, it lists his spiritual disposition, because the spiritual disposition is an insight into the spiritual disposition of the nation. And in fact, that is true of the history of Israel even before they had kings. The spiritual disposition of the leader of the Israelites was a direct insight into the spiritual disposition of the nation. In fact, at its conception, very, very baby Israel was under the leadership of Abraham, whose spiritual foundation is written of as the foundation and root. It was sort of rooted in the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings and their covenant that God had made with him. And in fact, it was actually rooted in this truth that 700 years later, the people of Israel, basically the sons and daughters of Abraham, would be able to go into the land of Canaan and live there peacefully. And then after Abraham, Moses led the people of Israel from out of oppression and slavery in Egypt because the Lord was daily equipping him to do so. And even when the Israelites went astray and began worshiping worthless idols, it was Moses that interceded on their behalf and led the people back to a faith in the rescuer. And it was Joshua, after Moses, that led the people of Israel after wandering in the desert to the promised land. And they took it up 700 years after Abraham made a covenant with God. Because the whole time, the Israelites were being led by God and were faithfully seeking him and repenting when they went wrong, which was often, for sure. Make no mistake about it, the spiritual disposition of the leaders of Israel mattered. Now, if you were to peruse the book of Judges, which comes after the Israelites are settled in the promised land, you'll notice that successive individuals are chosen by God to rescue the Israelites from an enemy or enemies and establish some sort of justice in their society. And even with this, they did not seek the guidance and wisdom of God. Rather, they sort of just did what was right in their own eyes. In fact, the book of Judges ends in chapter 21, verse 25, and it says, "In those days, there was no king in Israel." There was no king in Israel. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The spiritual disposition was not one of righteousness, but one of following the glamour of self-will. King Saul would be anointed by the prophet Samuel in Samuel 1 later after the Judges, and Saul loved the Lord and served him for a time, but his seeking of the Lord was choked out by the glamour he found in self-will. He was jealous about everything and everyone, and he led the people astray. King David then was the greatest king of Israel that they ever had, still is known as that, because even though he was a sinner, his disposition was always one of staying committed to the leading of God in his life and in the life of Israel. But after David's son Solomon, the kingdom was divided into two parts. We know these two parts as the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. And check this out, 39 kings would come between the two kingdoms, and only 6 of the 39 kings would have the thing right next to them, that phrase, would do right in the eyes of the Lord. And none of the 6 were kings of the northern kingdom, Israel. Now, if we take a look at 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 3 through 6, here's what it tells us befalls Israel at the hands of Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria. It says, "Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute." A vassal has to pay tribute. It's like you're bowing down to another king. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, which was the capital city of Israel. And for 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites away to Assyria and placed them in Halah and on the harbor, the river of Gozan. These cities in the Medes, and ultimately these cities are incredibly far apart, so that they couldn't be reunited. So we ultimately get clued into this key aggressor, right? The key aggressor. So the king of Assyria captures Samaria, and he carries the Israelites away. And ultimately, Shalmaneser will die, but Sargon II will come into power after Shalmaneser, and he'll carry out the same plan of sacking Israel. And this happens because Israel broke a covenant condition, the covenant condition, which is to remain committed to the leading of God. They broke the covenant. They became, you know what, we don't even believe in this God anymore. They broke the covenant. They stopped being committed to God. In fact, didn't even really act as if he even existed. And the text clues us in that Hoshea, the king of Israel, became a vassal, which means he bowed down to the authority of Shalmaneser V, meaning he was now simply a pawn in whatever Shalmaneser's plans and purposes were. He would have to do whatever he said. So literally no freedom. Well, obviously, Hoshea hates this position he was put in. He doesn't want this at all. And we actually see that Hoshea is a bit of a coward. He decides that, okay, I made this decision to pay tribute, but now I don't want to do it. So he sort of weasels his way out of being a vassal. It does not fulfill his duties as a vassal and is put in prison. Then Shalmaneser invades all the land, besieges the northern kingdom of Israel, and we know that Israel has now been sacked. And so as a result of this, we see political cataclysm is not actually the result of Hoshea's political decision, but the result of Israel's sin. Now, it seems like Hoshea is a bad dude, and that's true. But in verse 7 of 2 Kings chapter 17, we pick up this truth that it's actually not Hoshea that leads to political cataclysm. It's actually the result of sin. Now, starting in verse 7, and we'll read on from there, it says, and this cataclysm occurred, because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations, whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the king of Israel had practiced. And you'll notice too that God is actually very clearly stating the sins of Israel. They feared other gods. They walked in the customs. And check this out. Israel did secretly against the Lord. Their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. And they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger, and they served idols. And then if we keep going down where it's highlighted, you'll see, but they would not listen, because they were stubborn as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them time after time after time again, after Samuel the prophet, after Elijah, after Elisha, and then even the prophets that would come. They would just forsake these warnings. They wouldn't listen to them. And as a result, their sin led to political cataclysms. So, in so many ways, when we pick up in verse 7, we see that the people of Israel refused to commit themselves to the leading of God in their life. They broke the covenant and they were sacked. In fact, what they have done is they have proven themselves unworthy and were ended as they began under bondage and oppression. They were no longer a people and no longer remembered. They were geographically exiled. Now, it was the Lord, and it's important for us to recognize this, who removed Israel out of his sight. He is the author of this cataclysm, but let's be very clear. It was sin that caused separation between the Israelites and God. It was the sin that caused chaos, because sin does indeed cause chaos. We learned that in Genesis 3. Sin causes cataclysm. If we look back at Adam and Eve, that brought about this sort of new era marked by being banished from the presence of God. And so too now is Israel as a result of their sin. Now you might be wondering, just because the Israelites were geographically displaced, it doesn't mean that God's presence is absent from them. And you would be right, because that is a very good theological observation, to know that God is omnipresent. He's all over the place. His presence can't be removed from them. So then where is the presence of God? Well, specifically for the Israelites, the presence of God is in the temple. And that temple will actually be ransacked and destroyed as a result of the political cataclysm, and will happen here in a few years. And so what ends up happening is sort of the result of 2 Kings 17, this exile of the Israelites, is that we actually understand a second truth when we see the destruction of Judah and the destruction of the temple. That political cataclysms are caused by sin first, but second, they reveal spiritual cataclysms. They reveal spiritual cataclysms. In fact, the Babylonian Empire captures the kingdom of Judah and destroys the temple. And we pick that up in 2 Kings 25, which is what Sarah read for us. And in verse 19, it says, and Zedekiah, king of Judah, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. There it is again. according to all that Jehoiakim, his predecessor, had done. For because the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence, banished from the presence of God. And the Israelites did this to themselves. They betrayed their own freedom and sold themselves into exile right back where they started, forsaking the covenantal mercy of God for the sake of lifeless idols and secret sins. And even that part, I don't know, in that part that was highlighted, that they did stuff in secret, that's actually a type of atheism, where you do it in the sense, well, oh, God's not looking, God's not here, God's not seeing me. But that's saying, essentially, you're acting as if God doesn't even exist. These secret sins, right, led to their fall. And this, in so many ways, is the sin of unbelief. There is no belief in an almighty covenantal God. They traded him in for something worthless long ago. And a result, were given over to the adversaries. They turned into vassals. Now, the Israelites went from freedom to bondage, both geographically and spiritually. So we see a geographic exile, but also spiritual exile. They became vassals where they had to pay tribute to a selfish, wicked, and finite earthly king of Assyria, instead of living as vessels where they are guided and directed by a covenantal God who is merciful and gracious. In many ways, a new era had started for the people of Israel. And let me tell you, the outlook now is bleak, because the great light, the light that had led them through the wilderness, the light that had guided and protected them when they were in the land of Canaan for so long, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, had removed them from his sight. So then, we learn two very important truths from 2 Kings about political cataclysms. That political cataclysms are, number one, caused by sin. But then that political cataclysms also reveal a spiritual cataclysm. And so these two things sort of reveal to us a sudden change or disruption that creates a new era that we're ushered into. Well, these two truths that we learn about political cataclysms, we have to ask a question of them. How do we then live in light of these two truths? How do they help us understand what cataclysm we're going through even today, even a double cataclysm, if you will? Well, we have experienced a double cataclysm. A natural and political cataclysm in COVID-19, and the political cataclysm that is the imperative national awakening to the horrid racism and systemic oppression of our brothers and sisters of color. And as we've been ushered into this new era, we have to ask, as a follower of Christ, how now shall we live? Shall we live afraid of tomorrow, riddled with anxiety, questioning who's in control of all of this? Shall we live worried about what other people think of us if we move from pacifists to activists? Shall we live concerned about whether someone thinks we're even doing enough? Shall we live worried that our world is crumbling around us and that peace seems to be nowhere near? Or even asking the question, where is God in a coronavirus world? Well, friends, it's unmistakable that we as the people of God, even in the midst of this, are being called into a new era to commit ourselves to the leading of God in our lives. Very specifically, an ancient calling to be vessels, a Genesis calling that so many matriarchs and patriarchs of our faith were committed to. They were committed to being vessels and not vassals. You see, a vassal lives in unhealthy fear, a subordinate position, a place of perpetual bondage, but a vessel sails sure, confident, and with joy because they are being directed and guided to do exactly what they were created to do. And God has called you, has called me in this new era to be a vessel, to be valued, to be set apart, to be holy, so that you and me, that we can experience the fullness of joy by being an instrument in the Redeemer's hands. And ultimately, the result of living as vessels is not only benefit you in the sense that you find the fullness of joy, but the result of living as vessels is that others experience the fullness of joy because they will meet Jesus through you. So the result of living as vessels is that others experience the fullness of joy, because they'll meet Jesus through you. Now, there's this incredible book that perhaps you've read, and I'm sure you have, but even if you haven't, I really recommend reading it. It's called Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis. And in Screwtape Letters, a chief demon named Uncle Screwtape writes to his young nephew, who is an in-training demon, and he writes this about seeing men and women becoming vessels. He says this. He says, when God talks of their losing their selves, he means only abandoning the glamour of self-will. Once they have done that, he really gives them back all their personality and boasts, I'm afraid sincerely, says the demon, that when they are wholly his, they will be more themselves than ever. When they are wholly his, they will be more themselves than ever. And I just can't help but feel like I want to feel more myself than ever, even in a moment in history where we feel so disoriented. Now I think about 1 John 1:9. Why would I even want to be a vessel? Or even, what does it even mean to be a vessel? Well, John says this, if we confess our sins, he is faithful, meaning God, and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Cleanses us of our unrighteousness. He makes us holy. And then in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, the epistle, Paul says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And so what does it mean to be a vessel? Well, it means, friends, to be what God created you to be. And the greatest vessel that we've ever seen, that we've ever known, is the vessel that set you and I free. His name is Jesus. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 40, part B through 44, Jesus and the disciples, before Jesus is about to be crucified so that you and I could be set free from our bondage and sin. Here's what happens. Jesus is talking to the disciples and he says, hey, disciples, go, I'm going to pray, but pray that you may not enter into temptation. And then Jesus withdrew from about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, meaning death. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him, right at that moment, an angel from heaven. And God strengthened him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. And so what we see so clearly in this is that Jesus is relinquishing all control over to his Father, even in the midst of his circumstances. He's not distracted by the glamour of self-will, but instead he's wholly devoted to the will of the Father, even to the point of death, even death on a cross, because for two reasons. First, he loves the Father, but second, he loves you. He does it because he loves the Father, but he also does it because he loves you. He is committed to being a vessel, an instrument in the hands of the Father, brought about your freedom and my freedom to be vessels and to sail sure and confident that we serve a merciful and loving God who has two things: not forsaken us in the midst of our current cataclysm, but two, has given us meaning and purpose in the midst of our current cataclysm. And so we see these two truths in the midst of our double cataclysm, that God has not forsaken us, that God has given us meaning and purpose by calling us to be vessels. And so those truths ask us a big question. Will we follow Jesus' lead and live as vessels? Will we follow Jesus' lead to be vessels, to sail sure and steady, because we know that God is in control and his purposes are good, not only for us, but for all. And in the midst of these moments, I think that is the word that I need to hear, the thing that I need to live into, because there are so many moments in my life where I've failed to be a vessel because I'm scared, because I become a vassal to the world, because I become a vassal to what I want, to the glamour of my self-will, instead of becoming a vessel where my mission and purpose is clear. And in that mission and purpose, I can find the fullness of joy. And that's precisely what Jesus is inviting you and me into, is to be vessels. And I think, even thinking back about where we started, thinking about Professor Kellogg as he heard, the grotesque regime of Germany, and thinking about the natural selection and just sort of thinking about how they could sort of rule everyone and that they would be superior, And Kellogg, he immediately was like, you know what? No, that's wrong. We have got to take action. And I think in the midst of our world right now, I'm not trying to parallel, so this is a disclaimer, I'm not trying to parallel Germany and Satan. That's not what I'm doing, but hear this, okay? That the evil in our world is a result of sin, and Satan wants to see us quarrel and fight and hate one another. Satan wants to see us not love one another, and he wants to see us become vassals and not vessels. And so what we have to be is a people that is sure and confident in Christ because of what he's done for us. And as a result of it, whatever that might mean, maybe you're in a place where you're just educating yourself on systemic oppression, and you're going to allow that education, the things that you're learning, to then help you make real change. Or maybe even in the midst of this COVID time, you're thinking, you know what, I'm going to take action. I'm going to love my neighbor even more than I love myself. I'm going to do something for them so that they can experience Christ. I don't know what that looks like, but I think it looks like us really genuinely pondering the question, will I follow Jesus' lead and live as a vessel? And so in that question, I just want to close. And I want that to be a question that we don't just think about for this afternoon or think about for over dinner tonight with whoever, but instead be a question that we're constantly thinking about for life. Because that's really what it is. A call to be a vessel is a life calling, a call to, in your life, to see that, you know what, there are going to be times that even though you're seeking to be a vessel, there are going to be times when you fail. But God is giving you so much grace in the midst of those failures. And you, in turn, also have to give grace to yourself. I know for me, I've been thinking about this time, it's like, I just don't feel like I'm doing enough. Like, I don't know what to do. And sometimes I just feel sort of disoriented. And I've had to learn to give myself more grace as I'm learning and growing and figuring out how I take my next steps, and how Sydney and I as a family, how we figure out how to follow Jesus in the midst of the cataclysms that we're experiencing. But the good news, friends, is that we get to do that together. And not only do we get to do it together, but we get to do it guided and directed by the one who has all wisdom. So let's be bold enough to ask him about that.